Hello everyone, tonight we begin with a web spun not by silk, but by stories a spider's net stretched over children's dreams. From grandmothers weaving circles of willow, to catch the darkness before it reached a cradle, two feathers swaying like tiny ladders guiding good dreams down, to the cruel irony of sacred objects ending up as glitter-coated gas station souvenirs. This is the hidden life of the Dreamcatcher. If you enjoy wandering through these strange corners of history and myth with me, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is as you join us. There's something quietly magical about knowing who else is awake with me right now. So, dim the lights, maybe make some tea, let the room settle into a soft hush, and let's step together into the world where even sleep needed protection. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Imagine being born into a world where your nightmares weren't just shrugged off as bad cheese or late-night doomscrolling, but treated like dangerous visitors creeping in through the cracks of sleep. In that world, no one would laugh if you said a spider could save you. In fact, they'd nod solemnly. Because among the Ojibwe people long before crystal shops turned Dreamcatcher into a mass-produced trinket, the Spider-Woman was the one keeping children safe at night. Yes, a cosmic arachnid matriarch was on nursery duty. Try pitching that to modern parents who panic if a ladybug crawls into the crib. You see, the Ojibwe weren't wasting time pretending dreams were just brain static. Dreams were serious business, messages from the spirit world, guidance for tomorrow, warnings about danger. Nightmares, though, those were intruders, sneaky little parasites that slithered down onto the sleeper like damp ivy, leaving you shaken. And here's where it gets wonderfully strange. The Spider-Woman, Asai Bikoshi, spun webs not in the corners of your cabin, but in the invisible air above children's sleep. Her web caught the bad dreams before they could wriggle into the mind. Picture your grandmother telling you, "Don't worry, the spider's watching over you." Comforting if you believe it, absolutely terrifying if you don't. But there was a problem. The Ojibwe didn't stay clustered in one tight-knit village forever. They spread out across the land, their families scattered farther than any one spider could reasonably crawl. Imagine a Saibikoshi trying to cover half the Great Lakes region with silk she'd look like an overworked call center employee, tangled in threads and deadlines. So the women, the mothers, and grandmothers picked up the slack. They started weaving little replicas of the Spider-Woman's web out of willow hoops and sinew, hanging them above children's cradles. You could almost hear them thinking, "If the gods are too busy, fine, I'll do it myself." Maternal delegation at its finest. And this wasn't just craft time. These webs weren't supposed to be pretty. They were designed to work. A hoop of willow bent into a circle to echo the cycles of sun, moon, and life itself. A web stretched across it, delicate but deliberate, to filter the unseen. The good dreams, those shimmering messages, worth remembering, slipped gently through the gaps, sliding down feathers tied to the hoop until they reached the sleeping child's head. The bad ones, trapped in the web, wriggling all night until the morning sun burned them to ash. Think about that. Your toddler's first security system wasn't a baby monitor, it was a solar-powered dream trap that doubled as cosmology. And because nature doesn't do permanence, these early Dreamcatchers weren't built to last. Willow bends, sinew frays, feathers decay. They were supposed to wither, just as childhood does. A reminder that protection, like all things, is temporary. That's the bit Hallmark forgot to print on the souvenir cards. So if you'd been born there, instead of here, your earliest memory wouldn't have been some stuffed cartoon character glaring from above your crib. It would have been a fragile hoop, woven by your grandmother's hands, dangling feathers that swayed every time the night air whispered. And when you woke up safe, she'd smile knowingly, as if to say, "Yes, the spider caught it." You wouldn't laugh, you'd believe it. And for the rest of your life, you'd never sleep in quite the same way again. So now you've got this fragile little hoop dangling above your cradle, courtesy of your mother's hands and the Spider-Woman's cosmic job description. But here's the real question. How exactly does a circle of willow and sinew separate nightmares from divine advice? You might think of it as early spiritual engineering. Less Pinterest craft project, more sleep security system with warranty coverage provided by the sun itself. The circle wasn't arbitrary. To the Ojibwe, the hoop stood in for everything cyclical: the sun's path, the moon's glow, the turning of the seasons, the very wheel of life rolling endlessly forward, whether you're ready or not. It was geometry with theology baked in. You weren't just staring at a ring. You were staring at a portable universe. Nothing like being swaddled in cosmic philosophy before you could even crawl. Inside that circle stretched the web. Not tight and perfect like a modern spider's net, but laced with deliberate gaps. Small pathways left open on purpose. The logic was elegant. Nightmares, like mosquitoes, are too stupid to find the exit. They thrash and tangle themselves in the cords until daylight burns them away. The good dreams, the ones worth keeping, find the gaps with ease, slipping through to land softly in the feathers below. And those feathers, swaying in the dark, weren't just decoration. They were conduits. They guided the dream down like a ladder, so that by the time it brushed your forehead, you were already halfway to believing it. It's worth pausing here to notice how un-Western this idea is. Our modern culture tends to sort things into good and bad with the subtlety of a middle school cafeteria line. But the Ojibwe didn't view dreams as mere nonsense or nightmares, as simple terrors. Dreams were messengers. They carried instructions, warnings, and sometimes entire cosmologies tucked between the fragments of your subconscious. To filter them was to participate in the ongoing balance between humans and the spirit world. Think less, self-care, bedtime ritual, more border patrol between realms. And of course, it wasn't just about psychology, it was about survival. Sleep in the old days wasn't a cozy Netflix pause. It was vulnerability incarnate. You drift off in your birchbark lodge, and suddenly the wolves howl. Or worse, your mind drags you through horrors that leave you trembling in the morning. A bad dream could weaken your spirit, make you hesitant, scatter your focus. And in a world where hesitation might mean falling through thin ice, or missing the deer in your bow's line, nightmares weren't trivial, they were existential threats. Which is why it mattered so much that the web was there, silent, invisible, working while you couldn't. Every morning, when the first light touched the hoop, it was said to kill off whatever foul things had been caught overnight. The sun wasn't just rising, it was cleansing. Imagine waking up each day with the reassurance that even if your night was restless, the morning itself had erased the filth. Modern folks need 3 lattes and a podcast to get that feeling. So if you'd been that child, blinking awake under the first streaks of dawn, you wouldn't just yawn and shuffle off. You'd know that something out there had been trapped and destroyed on your behalf. You'd feel lighter, safer, as though the very structure above your head had negotiated with the unseen and won. That's the web of protection, not superstition, but architecture for the soul. Why now? You've probably noticed that in this world, dreams weren't brushed aside with a lazy, it was just your imagination. Oh no. If you'd been Ojibwe, your dreams would have been filed under messages from the spirit world and treated with more respect than your actual waking opinions. Imagine telling your aunt today that the dream you had last night should determine your life choices. She'd send you to therapy. Among the Ojibwe, she'd send you to the elders. Different responses, same look of concern, very different outcomes. Dreams were a channel. They were porous bridges where ancestors, spirits, and sometimes the land itself spoke. A dream could warn you of illness, reveal where the deer had moved, or carry an instruction from forces you didn't dare ignore. You weren't hallucinating. You were attending a night class taught by the cosmos. Some dreams were precious visions to guide your path, like secret letters slipped under the door by unseen relatives. Others were dangerous nightmares, tangled and heavy, dragging at your chest like stones tied to your breath. These weren't random. They were invaders, distortions, sometimes even hostile spirits, trying to weaken you. This is where the Dreamcatcher wasn't just decoration, it was intervention. It sorted the messages from the garbage. The good dreams, with their hidden guidance, passed through. The nightmares got stuck, silenced before they could corrode your spirit. Picture it like the world's oldest spam filter, but instead of blocking car insurance ads, it was protecting you from demons whispering that you should give up on the hunt. And unlike modern psychology, which loves to tell you that your dreams reflect your subconscious, the Ojibwe weren't sitting around interpreting your repressed desire to eat cake in front of your ex. They saw dreams as dialogues, not diagnostics. You weren't talking to yourself, you were listening to the world around you, to the spirits of rivers, animals, and those who came before. If you had a nightmare, it wasn't about your mother not hugging you enough. It was about forces that didn't want you to thrive. Practical, direct, brutally spiritual. Now, imagine being raised in that system. You wouldn't casually dismiss a nightmare about drowning. You'd talk to an elder, ask what the water wanted from you. maybe even adjust your actions the next day. Dreams demanded action, not detachment. If you ignored them, you weren't just neglecting your mental health, you were thumbing your nose at the spirit world, which was a spectacularly bad idea if you wanted crops, hunts, or relationships to go smoothly. And yet, it wasn't all terror. Some dreams were visions of beauty hunts that ended well, ancestors appearing with advice, even spiritual callings. In Ojibwe tradition, vision quests relied heavily on dreams. A young person fasting in isolation hoped for a dream that would reveal their purpose, a glimpse of the path laid out for them. Imagine puberty combined with cosmic internship interviews, where your dream resume decided if you'd be healer, warrior, or wanderer, a nightmare during that career ending. Hence the need for Dreamcatchers, steady guards to ensure the right dreams arrived on time. If you'd lived in that world, your mornings wouldn't start with what's for breakfast, but with what did my dream mean. And if you dared say, I didn't remember it, people wouldn't just shrug, they'd frown. Because forgetting was suspicious, a sign the message had been blocked, or worse, stolen. And nothing ruins your day quite like realizing even your sleep can be sabotaged. If you've made it this far, you already know that Dreamcatcher wasn't some bohemian room accessory, it was a functional device. And like all devices, its power came not just from what it symbolized, but from what it was made of. Now, if you'd been born into an Ojibwe family 200 years ago, you wouldn't see a Dreamcatcher made of shiny metal hoops and rainbow yarn. You'd see something raw, fragile, and temporary, because that's how life itself was understood. The hoop was willow, always willow. It bends easily, smooth and pliable when freshly cut, but it doesn't last. Over time, it dries, cracks, and collapses, just like the childhood it was meant to guard. There's a certain poetry in knowing your first protection was designed to disintegrate, reminding everyone that safety is never permanent. Not quite the heirloom gift you'll find in today's tourist shops, but far more honest. Inside that hoop stretched the web, woven from sinew animal tendon, cleaned and stretched until it became thread. Think about it. Every night your dreams filtered through the literal fibers of another creature's body. This wasn't decoration. It was sacrifice embedded in craft. Something had died to make sure your nightmares didn't consume you. Sleep, then, was tethered to the bones of survival. Try telling that to anyone today who insists they can't sleep without lavender spray. Then there were the feathers, tied gently to the bottom of the hoop. They weren't random flair. Feathers represented breath, air, and life itself. When the good dreams slipped through the web, they traveled down the feathers like whispers, drifting toward your sleeping body. A single feather could stand for a bird species, an ancestral line, or a reminder that life is carried on the wind. In other words, every time you twitched in your sleep, you were literally brushing against cosmology. And sometimes, artisans added beads, shells, or small stones. Each had its purpose. A bead in the web could symbolize the spider herself, forever present in the structure. Shells tied the Dreamcatcher to water, balancing the air of feathers with the fluidity of rivers and lakes. Stones might anchor the object to the earth, completing a circle of elements: sky, water, earth, all dangling quietly above a child's head. Not bad for what most outsiders dismiss as folk art, but perhaps the most fascinating thing is that these Dreamcatchers weren't built to outlast you. They were ephemeral. Over months or years, they'd weaken, fray, and fall apart. And that wasn't failure, that was intention. Just as a child grows out of infancy, the Dreamcatcher's role expired. To cling to it forever would be to misunderstand its purpose. Compare that to today's mass-produced versions, which can outlive their owners in perfect plastic condition, still dangling in bedrooms long after their buyers stopped believing in anything but their phone alarms. If you'd been raised with the old materials, you'd know that every thread mattered. You'd understand that protection wasn't a permanent contract, but a temporary grace, woven from the gifts of plants, animals, and ancestors. And maybe, just maybe, you'd sleep with a little more gratitude, aware that your safety was a collaboration, not a guarantee. By now you've got the picture. Willow hoop, sinew web, feathers drifting like the breath of birds. But let me ask you, who did the weaving? If you'd been born Ojibwe, it wouldn't have been your father hammering together Dreamcatchers after a long day of fishing. No, this was women's workmothers, grandmothers, aunts bending close in the dim light, hands busy with the delicate task of catching the invisible. The men might have hunted the deer whose sinew became thread, but it was women who turned those scraps of the animal into architecture for the spirit world. Think about that. Every night of your childhood, your sleep depended not just on ritual or myth, but on the practical devotion of the women in your family. They were the ones sitting cross-legged with willow hoops, fingers looping and knotting, humming songs that may or may not have been prayers, weaving webs, not for themselves, but for the fragile bundle in the cradle beside them. No applause, no recognitions, the quiet authority of women protecting the future while everyone else pretended not to need them. And this wasn't busy work, the kind of women's craft dismissed in Western history as quaint decoration. This was serious. It was survival. A poorly woven dreamcatcher meant the web was flawed, the filter incomplete. If nightmares slipped through, the child might wake crying, unsettled, spirit rattled. The weaver's reputation depended on precision. Imagine the stakes. Your needlework wasn't judged by neighbors at the quilting bee, but by whether your baby stopped screaming at midnight. That's not a hobby. That's accountability with teeth. Of course, weaving also tied directly into the symbolic role of women as creators of life. Just as mothers knit flesh and bone in the womb, they extended that creative act into objects that held spiritual significance. A child didn't just arrive into the world naked, they arrived wrapped in layers of protection, both biological and cosmological, spun by the hands of women. The dreamcatcher was an umbilical cord made visible, connecting the child to safety even after birth. And let's not forget, this was generational work. Grandmothers taught daughters, daughters taught granddaughters. Each web wasn't just a filter for dreams, but a thread in the larger fabric of cultural continuity. Knowledge passed from hand to hand, loop to loop. No written manual, no YouTube tutorial. Just watching, imitating, and eventually mastering. If you made a mistake, your mother noticed. If you improved, your grandmother smiled. Entire lineages of women were preserved, not in books, but in the memory of fingers weaving sinew through willow hoops. If you'd been born there, you wouldn't just remember the dreamcatcher above your bed, you'd remember watching it being made. You'd recall the smell of fresh willow, the tug of sinew tightened across the frame, the soft rustle of feathers tied with deliberate care. You'd remember the sound of your mother's voice explaining why the circle mattered, why the gaps in the web were left open, why the morning sun mattered more than you knew. And you'd realize, years later, that she wasn't just giving you an object. She was giving you a worldview, passed down in knots and loops. So while history loves to crown kings and warriors, here's the truth. It was the women who built the first lines of defense. They didn't carry spears or give speeches. They wove, quietly and relentlessly, ensuring that nightmares didn't take root in the next generation. If you'd been one of their children, you'd fall asleep each night under a net of maternal defiance, blissfully unaware that while you dreamed, your grandmother's fingers had already fought the first battle for you. So there you are, drifting to sleep under the watch of your grandmother's handiwork. And maybe you're too young to notice that the dreamcatcher isn't just a pretty shape. That circle above your head is more than carpentry. For toddlers, it's cosmology. If you'd been Ojibwe, you'd have learned early that circles are the architecture of the universe. No sharp corners, no beginnings or endings, just the endless looping of time, life, and responsibility. The hoop wasn't chosen because it looked nice. It was chosen because everything sacred came back around. The sun traced a circle across the sky every day, reliable as breath. The moon cycled through her phases, teaching you that darkness and light are just different parts of the same loop. The seasons turned, each one dying into the next, only to return again. To make a dreamcatcher square would have been an insult to nature itself, like trying to fit the Great Lakes into a shoebox. No, only a circle could hold the web, because only a circle told the truth about how the world actually worked. And it wasn't just natural cycles, it was human ones too. Birth, childhood, adulthood, death, and the return of spirit to the world. One continuous hoop. By sleeping under that ring, you weren't just being protected from nightmares. You were being reminded, night after night, that you were inside the circle of life. Your existence wasn't a solo career. You were a link in a chain, a bead strung along a loop that would continue long after you. There's a strange irony here. Western culture loves to draw its power in straight lines, progress, conquest, timelines that march forward like soldiers on parade. Meanwhile, the Ojibwe kept their wisdom in circles, insisting that you can't escape what you're part of. You don't outrun the sun. You don't graduate from the seasons. and you definitely don't avoid death. You turn back into the earth, and the circle folds you in. The Dreamcatcher was a child's first geometry lesson. Welcome to infinity, kid. Better get used to it. And the circle didn't just contain the web, it gave it authority. Without the hoop, the sinew would just collapse into string. It's the same way life works. The cycle framed the chaos. Without the shape, the web of dreams has nowhere to hold. The circle was the law, the order, the reminder that even nightmares have their place, caught and held within something larger. It was discipline disguised as design. If you'd grown up there, the circle would have been everywhere. In dances, in drums, in council fires arranged so no one sat above the other. The world was circular, and the Dreamcatcher above your bed was your first tutor in that truth. Every time the hoop cracked with age, every time it bent under the strain of sinew, you were watching life itself repeat, strong when new, fragile when old, always curving back to where it began. And here's the part no one puts on souvenir keychains. The circle was humbling. It meant you weren't the center of the universe. You were part of its endless motion, spinning whether you wanted to or not. Sleep inside a square, and you might think you're in control. Sleep under a circle, and you're reminded you're just another passenger on the wheel. By now, you might be wondering, who came up with this idea in the first place? Surely somebody had to explain why bits of willow and sinew could guard your dreams. And this is where the story gets deliciously strange. If you'd been Ojibwe, your elders would have told you about Asabikoshi the Spider-Woman. Yes, you heard me right. Not a saint, not a warrior, not a celestial bureaucrat. A spider. The original guardian of children's dreams, had 8 legs and a patience for weaving that made your grandmother look lazy. Asabikoshi's role was simple. She protected the people, especially children, by weaving invisible webs to snare the dark things that drifted in with sleep. When the Ojibwe lived closer together, this was manageable. Picture a cosmic babysitter, moving quietly through lodges at night, stringing invisible threads to block nightmares. Not bad as far as divine job descriptions go. But then, as the people spread across the land, her task became impossible. One spider, however supernatural, couldn't keep up with an entire nation scattered from lake to lake. That's when the women took over. Mothers and grandmothers, understanding the Spider-Woman couldn't be everywhere, began to replicate her work. The Dreamcatcher wasn't just a clever invention, it was delegation, a mythological handoff. Asabikoshi had spun the first webs, but now human hands were responsible for carrying her power forward. Imagine being told as a child, the Spider-Woman can't reach you herself, but she taught us how to weave her web. That's both comforting and slightly terrifying, like hearing your guardian angel outsourced your safety to your mum. The story wasn't just bedtime fluff, it embedded a worldview. It said that danger existed, yes, but that it could be caught, held, neutralized. It said that women's work wasn't just domestic, it was by weaving the web, mothers weren't decorating cradles. They were literally stepping into the role of a sacred being, channeling Asabikoshi's protective power. Try telling me that's craft. That's theology in action, dangling above your head while you drool on your blanket. And the spider wasn't chosen at random. In Ojibwe thought, the spider is patient, tireless, deliberate. She builds something fragile yet enduring, dangerous yet protective. The web, after all, is both trap and sanctuary. It catches prey but also shields the spider. That paradox, something both delicate and powerful, was exactly what children needed while they slept. A web may look flimsy, but it holds. Just as the willow hoop looks temporary, yet it carries meaning strong enough to last centuries. If you'd grown up hearing this story, spiders wouldn't make you shriek. You'd see one in the corner and nod respectfully, maybe even mutter a greeting. You'd remember that once upon a time, an 8-legged grandmother watched over you, and the next time you had a nightmare, you wouldn't dismiss it as random brain static. You'd look up at the hoop above your bed and know that the Spider-Woman's legacy was still at work, still catching the shadows that dared to cross into your sleep. Oh, you've got the Spider-Woman's story, the circle, the web, the feathers. If you'd been Ojibwe, that was your inheritance. But here's the twist. By the 20th century, this little cradle charm had already packed its bags and gone traveling. It slipped across tribal boundaries, found new homes, and picked up new meanings, like a hitchhiker collecting stickers on a battered suitcase. What began in Ojibwe lodges spread to Lakota, Cherokee, and beyond, until the Dreamcatcher became one of the most recognizable symbols in native North America. But let's be clear, this wasn't because some artisan thought, hey, this'll sell well in Denver. It spread through something much older and messier: contact, trade, intermarriage, and eventually the pan-Indian movement of the 1960s and 70s. That movement, fueled by civil rights, urban relocation, and good old-fashioned rage at centuries of colonial violence, pulled together diverse nations under one banner of shared identity. And what symbol could be simpler, more portable, more quietly powerful than a dream catcher? No translation needed, no treaties required, just a hoop and a web that said, "We're still here." Among the Lakota, the Dreamcatcher took on slightly different interpretations. Some told of Iktomi, the trickster spider, who spun webs to entangle and deceive it, who could also be a teacher if you paid attention. That's the beauty of cultural adoption. A single object can shift like water, reflecting different skies depending on who looks into it. Where the Ojibwe saw maternal protection, the Lakota sometimes saw a moral puzzle. Use the web wisely, or get trapped in your own illusions. Either way, the hoop above your bed was now more than regional, it was intertribal. And let's not pretend it was just spiritual. The Dreamcatcher became political. When native activists marched, occupied, or rallied during the Red Power movement, you could spot Dreamcatchers hanging from banners or pinned to jackets. They were compact, recognizable, and rooted in tradition without being exclusive. You didn't need to be Ojibwe to understand the symbolism: protection, survival, filtering out poison. In other words, the perfect metaphor for indigenous resistance. A spider's web, fragile-looking, but capable of catching bigger, clumsier things, like colonialism. If you'd been alive during that period, you might have seen Dreamcatchers at protests or on flyers, woven into a new narrative of unity. They weren't just for cradles anymore. They were for communities. They said, "Nightmares don't win here." And that was a message everyone needed after generations of cultural erasure. Of course, adoption also meant adaptation. Materials shifted, meanings layered. Some communities used beads or colors to mark specific identities, blending old designs with new statements. What stayed consistent was the function: a filter, a boundary, a protective net against whatever bad spirits, literal or political, were trying to sneak through the cracks. So, while your grandmother might have hung one above your bed for safe sleep, by the time you were a teenager in the 1970s, you might have been wearing one on a necklace as a political badge. The shift wasn't a betrayal of tradition, it was a continuation. After all, what's the point of a dream catcher if not to keep evolving, catching the nightmares that fit the times? So by now, the Dreamcatcher's resume has expanded. Spiritual filter, cultural emblem, political symbol. But don't let the banners and protests fool you. Its first job was still the quiet one, guarding the fragile space between a child's breath and the darkness creeping into sleep. If you'd grown up Ojibwe, you wouldn't have seen Dreamcatchers as optional decor. They were necessary, part of the kit of life, like fire for warmth or birch bark for shelter. The most common place you'd find them: over cradles, small hoops, no bigger than a handspan, suspended above a sleeping infant. They weren't meant to impress guests. They weren't conversation pieces. They were guardians, hung close enough that the feathers might stir when the baby exhaled. Picture it: a new mother, exhausted, rocking her child to sleep, knowing the night could bring both rest and danger. That hoop above the cradle wasn't just a symbol, it was insurance, woven from bone and breath, holding back the nightmares she couldn't fight off herself. But Dreamcatchers weren't locked away in nurseries. They had ceremonial weight to. Some were woven specifically for rites of passage, marking transitions like puberty, marriage, or birth. Others appeared in healing contexts, woven for the sick, their webs tasked with straining out the spiritual poisons that might be festering in body or mind. And sometimes, though not always, they were made as gifts of honor. To give someone a dream catcher was to acknowledge their vulnerability, to say, "I want you safe in places I can't reach." And because they weren't commodities, each dream catcher carried the personality of its maker. One grandmother might favor tightly woven webs, another looser. One might tie feathers from a bird that carried particular significance: eagle for strength, an owl for wisdom, a duck for wealth, not wisdom, but survival. Every choice mattered. A bead wasn't just pretty, it was a charm, an anchor, maybe even a miniature stand-in for the Spider-Woman herself. If you'd received one, you wouldn't just say thank you, you'd study it, touch it, memorize its details. This wasn't mass production. This was love disguised as geometry. The personal role of Dreamcatchers also meant they weren't for everyone. They were primarily for children, for the young, for those still forming. Adults could and did use them, of course, but the emphasis was on guarding new life, and that made sense. A grown hunter might battle his nightmares by fasting or vision questing. A child, however, needed something gentler. The Dreamcatcher was the compromise. Protection without initiation, safety without struggle. Now, compare that to today's bedroom walls, where Dreamcatchers dangle next to neon signs and band posters. The irony is sharp. What once was a tool of survival and ceremony is now often an aesthetic, drained of its intimacy. But in its original form, the Dreamcatcher wasn't about looking good. It was about doing its job, filtering the unseen, weaving comfort where words fell short, ensuring that a child's dreams didn't turn against them. If you'd been raised in that world, you'd know the difference instinctively. A Dreamcatcher wasn't decoration, it was duty. It wasn't hung because it matched the room. It was hung because without it, the night felt incomplete, like walking into winter without firewood. And when you closed your eyes, you wouldn't wonder if it worked. You'd assume it did, because every feather above your bed whispered the same promise. Sleep, you're guarded. So far the Dreamcatcher has been a quiet hero hanging above cradles, woven by women, blessed by story. But here's where the night thickens. If you'd been Ojibwe in the 19th or early 20th century, your grandmother's web might have been more than protection, it might have been rebellion. Because colonialism didn't just come for the land, it came for the mind, the rituals, the objects that kept people tied to their world. And the Dreamcatcher, humble as it looked, didn't escape notice. Christian missionaries and government agents had a special talent for seeing danger in the smallest of things. To them, a circle of willow and sinew wasn't just a charm. It was pagan superstition, a threat to assimilation. Boarding schools, those infamous institutions designed to strip children of their languages. Hair and ceremonies taught native kids that their traditions were backwards. A Dreamcatcher above the bed wasn't protection anymore. It was evidence of savagery. Imagine being 6 years old, clutching the memory of feathers swaying above your cradle, only to be told by a uniformed teacher that it was nonsense, forbidden, even sinful. And yet, the webs didn't vanish. They went underground. Women still wove them quietly, in homes away from the surveillance of priests and schoolmasters. Sometimes they hid them among other objects, easy to miss unless you knew what you were looking for. A child might still fall asleep under one, though no one outside the family was allowed to know. It wasn't just about protection from nightmares anymore. It was protection from erasure. Ironically, while colonial authorities were busy banning pagan charms, they were also happily collecting them. Anthropologists, hobbyists, and museum curators swooped in, buying or stealing Dreamcatchers to display in glass cases, stripped of context. What had been a living practice became an artifact, something to be stared at under fluorescent lights. You can imagine the absurdity. Elders weaving in secrecy to protect their children, while the same object sat dusting in a European museum labeled primitive child amulet. Survival on one end, spectacle on the other. But suppression had its unintended effects. The very act of trying to erase Dreamcatchers only sharpened their importance. They became a quiet symbol of continuity, proof that not everything could be stamped out. Even when languages were punished, even when ceremonies were outlawed, the web endured, fragile in appearance, stubborn in reality. Like the spider herself, it clung to corners, invisible until you looked closely, impossible to fully destroy. If you'd been there, your relationship to the Dreamcatcher would have shifted. It wouldn't just be a childhood memory. It would be a secret inheritance, something your mother might whisper about when no one else could hear. She'd teach you how to weave, but she'd warn you not to show it in public. And in that act, passing the knowledge quietly, almost defiantly, you'd realize that the Dreamcatcher wasn't only catching nightmares anymore. It was catching culture, holding it safe until the world could change. And change it eventually did. By the time the 20th century rolled on, the Dreamcatcher was re-emerging, not just as a relic, but as a symbol of survival. But before it could take on that role, it had to endure decades of being shamed, stolen, or hidden away. A hoop of willow against the machinery of empire, and, somehow, the willow bent but never broke. Here's the cruel twist. After centuries of being suppressed, outlawed, and nearly erased, the Dreamcatcher didn't just survive, If you'd been Ojibwe in the 1970s, you might have seen your grandmother's delicate willow hoop reappear, not as sacred craft but as kitchen's wall hangings, and eventually bumper stickers sold to tourists who couldn't pronounce Ojibwe if their life depended on it. Colonialism first tried to kill the Dreamcatcher, and then capitalism said, "Wait, no, this'll look great in a motel gift shop." The irony's almost unbearable. For the Ojibwe, a Dreamcatcher wasn't built to last. Its willow frame was meant to bend, dry out, and eventually fall apart. But the commercial versions, they're indestructible. Plastic hoops wrapped in neon thread, feathers dyed hot pink, glass beads glued on like an arts and crafts apocalypse. The object that once embodied impermanence now sits in living rooms for decades, untouched by rot, untouched by meaning. A sacred filter turned into a dust collector. And don't get me started on scale. Traditional Dreamcatchers were small, no bigger than the palm of your hand, intimate, portable, meant for a cradle or a sleeping mat. Walk into a gas station today, and you'll see Dreamcatchers the size of bicycle wheels, hanging from ceilings like disco chandeliers. Good luck catching nightmares with that. More likely you're catching moths. But the real sting is in the hollowing out of meaning. For the Ojibwe, the Dreamcatcher was protection, tied to a story, a role, a responsibility. For the tourist trade, it became native chic, spiritual enough to feel exotic, vague enough not to scare the customers, sold without story, without context, stripped of the maternal labor and cosmological depth. Just another trinket, filed alongside turquoise rings and authentic tomahawks made in China. And yet here's where it gets tricky. It also spread awareness. Millions of people who had no idea the Ojibwe existed now knew the word Dreamcatcher. Yes, the object was cheapened, but it was also visible, which raises the awkward question: does survival through kitsch still count as survival? Some native activists argue, yes, it kept the symbol alive. Others say no, it turns sacred work into decoration, robbing it of power. Both are right, and both arguments sting. If you'd been raised with the real thing, seeing a fake would've felt like watching your family recipe served as a frozen microwave dinner. Same name, same shape, none of the taste. A hoop that looked right but smelled wrong. And when outsiders hung one above their bed, claiming it kept nightmares away, you'd know the truth. Without the story, without the care, it was just thread and feathers. No more magical than a laundry basket. But that's the strange destiny of sacred objects. They escape. They travel, they get remade into things their creators never intended. And while the elders might shake their heads at plastic knockoffs, the fact remains, the Dreamcatcher is still here. It survived suppression, and now it survives dilution. That doesn't make the commercial ones sacred. It just proves that even the strongest symbols can be bent, frayed, and misused and still refuse to vanish. By this point, you can already imagine the problem. Once Dreamcatchers got mass-produced, people started asking, what's real and what's fake? And the answer, if you'd grown up Ojibwe, was painfully obvious. Authentic Dreamcatchers weren't glowing neon monstrosities the size of a hula hoop. They were small, intimate, and almost temporary, closer to medicine than merchandise. They weren't meant to last forever. They were meant to work. Start with size. The originals were hand-sized, just big enough to hang over a cradle. A palm-sized web could filter dreams because it wasn't decoration, it was a tool. The massive Dreamcatchers hanging from car mirrors or hotel lobbies, those are like bringing a fishing net to catch a single goldfish, more for show than for substance. Then there's the material. Authentic Dreamcatchers used willow hoops, sinew threads, and feathers, each chosen deliberately, often tied to meaning. A real feather might carry the essence of a bird, eagle for strength, owl for wisdom, even something humble like duck for persistence. Plastic feathers dipped in glitter. That's not wisdom, that's craft store sadness. Traditional sinew, frayed and decayed over time, reminding you that protection has limits. Nylon thread doesn't fray, it just collects dust until you throw it away, which is about as spiritual as a broken shoelace. Authentic ones were also handmade, woven with care, often by a specific person for a specific child. They carried intention, which is half the point. Every knot tied was a mother's act of protection. Every feather attached a choice. Compare that to the factory-made knockoff, stamped out by the thousands, shrink-wrapped and shipped across oceans. That's not intention, that's inventory. If you think the Spider-Woman's blessing gets mass-distributed with bulk shipping, you've misunderstood the assignment. And here's a subtle difference. Authentic Dreamcatchers were quiet. They didn't scream for attention with neon colors or 5 dangling tiers of rhinestone feathers. They were simple, often plain. Their beauty came from purpose, not excess. The web itself mattered more than the decorations. If you'd been raised with the real thing, you'd know instantly when one looked wrong. It would feel heavy in your hand, not because of weight, but because of absence. The absence of care, of story, of meaning. Now, to be fair, not every modern Dreamcatcher outside native hands is malicious. Sometimes they're made in good faith, even admiration. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Without the context, without the grounding in Ojibwe story and maternal labor, they lose their function. They become empty shapes. You can hang one above your bed, sure, but unless it's tied to the tradition, it won't catch your nightmares. It'll just dangle there, a feathered placebo. If you'd grown up in a family of weavers, you'd see the difference instantly. You'd know the authentic ones by touch, by smell, by the slight irregularities that prove a human hand worked the threads. You'd smile at them, knowing they carried generations of meaning, and you'd probably roll your eyes at the giant, glitter-coated imposters hanging from gas station racks, because deep down you'd know, those things aren't Dreamcatchers. They're just souvenirs, spiderwebs with no spider. So far, the Dreamcatcher has swung between sacred cradle charm and mass-produced tchotchke. But here's where the story sharpens. If you'd been a native activist in the late 1960s, you wouldn't have seen a Dreamcatcher as just grandma's craft. You'd have seen it as a portable flag, a way to announce identity without needing a microphone. Small enough to hang from a belt, powerful enough to tell the world, we're still here, and our dreams are ours. The Red Power movement was rising, then indigenous people marching, occupying, and demanding rights after centuries of being told to vanish politely. And every movement needs symbols. The Black Panthers had their raised fist, feminists had their Venus sign, and native activists, they had drums, feathers, banners, and increasingly, Dreamcatchers. Why? Because they were instantly recognizable, rooted in tradition, yet flexible enough to stand for something bigger than one nation. If you were Ojibwe, it was your inheritance. If you were Lakota, Cherokee, Dine, it became a symbol of solidarity, an emblem of shared struggle. Picture an occupation at Alcatraz Island in 1969. Activists set up camp, refusing to leave, claiming the abandoned prison as native land. Amid the banners and campfires, Dreamcatchers dangled in the wind. To outsiders, maybe they looked quaint. To those inside, they were declarations. Your nightmares aren't ours. Our stories, our spirits, our children, they're still intact. A spider's web made visible, straining out centuries of colonial poison. And let's be honest, the symbolism was sharp. A Dreamcatcher is all about filtering, deciding what passes through and what gets trapped. Isn't that what the movement was doing? Catching the poison of assimilation, keeping only the parts of modernity that served survival. It was activism rendered in thread and feather, less a charm than a manifesto. Of course, like any symbol, its use wasn't uniform. Some saw it as too pan-Indian, a flattening of specific tribal traditions into a generalized image for outsiders. Others embraced that very flexibility, arguing that unity required common ground, and what better ground than a hoop everyone recognized. Either way, the Dreamcatcher left the nursery and entered the street, shifting from cradle guardian to political witness. If you'd been there, marching with one tied to your jacket, you wouldn't have thought of it as decoration. You'd have thought of your grandmother, your language, your right to live without apology. And when the media snapped photos of protests, those circles of willow and sinew whispered from the margins, reminding anyone who looked, native survival isn't metaphorical, it's woven. The irony, of course, is that while activists were reclaiming the Dreamcatcher as identity and resistance, stores were beginning to sell it as kitsch. On one side, it was a spiritual weapon. On the other, a souvenir for people on road trips. Both truths coexisted, but only one side remembered what those webs were really for, catching what could destroy you. So here we are, centuries after Asibikashi spun her first cosmic web, and Dreamcatchers are still being made. If you'd been born Ojibwe today, your grandmother might still weave one for you. Not to hang in a gas station, not to decorate an Airbnb, but to do what it was always meant to do, filter the night. Because despite all the cheap imitations floating around, the real ones still live where they always have, between a child's breath and the shadows trying to sneak in In many native families, Dreamcatchers are still made as gifts for newborns. A hoop bent from willow, sinews stretched into a web, feathers tied carefully to the bottom, no glitter, no neon thread, just the old materials, fragile and alive. If you received one, it wouldn't come with a price tag. It would come with a story. Your grandmother would tell you about the Spider-Woman, about the sun burning away the nightmares, about why the circle matters. The gift isn't just the object, it's the teaching that comes with it. And it's not only for babies. Today, Dreamcatchers sometimes mark milestones given to young people entering adulthood, to couples marrying, to friends in need of healing. They hang above hospital beds, carried into ceremonies, woven with specific intentions. A dreamcatcher given to a sick relative might have extra charms tied into its web beads, stones, feathers from particular birds. Each addition says something. Each choice encodes care. They're not random accessories. They're layered acts of protection, tailored to the person they're meant for. Of course, they've also adapted. Some artisans blend traditional materials with modern ones, not because they're cheap, but because they're meaningful. A hoop might still be willow, but the web could include dyed thread representing family colors, or beads marking clan symbols. The form is ancient, the message contemporary. Because the point isn't to freeze the dreamcatcher in time, like a museum piece. The point is to let it keep doing its job, catching what threatens and letting the rest through. And there's something striking about that continuity. Despite boarding schools, missionary bans, and mass-market knockoffs, native people still make dreamcatchers for their children. They still hang quietly in homes, still filter the night. Not as decorations, not as tourist bait, but as active tools. If you'd grown up there, you'd know the difference immediately. You'd never confuse your grandmother's hand-woven hoop with the giant, rhinestone-studded things on Etsy. One carried her breath, her time, her story. The other carried factory glue. But maybe the most important role dreamcatchers play today is cultural. They remind children and adults that they are part of something older, deeper, more resilient than the world wants them to believe. Every web says, you come from people who survived. Every circle whispers, your nightmares can be caught. Every feather insists, you still belong to the air, the land, the story. And that, more than anything, is why they're still woven. So if you had been born into that tradition, your bedroom wouldn't just have decor, it would have lineage hanging on the wall. And every time you woke in the morning, you wouldn't just feel rested, you'd feel connected, as if an 8-legged grandmother and a long line of human ones were still watching over you, even now. And now we reach the strange part of the story. If you'd been Ojibwe 2 centuries ago, you'd never have guessed that your grandmother's fragile little hoop would one day hang in dorm rooms in Berlin, yoga studios in São Paulo, and gas stations along Route 66. Today, dreamcatchers are global. Everybody seems to want one, though almost nobody knows why. It's the ultimate irony. What began as a spider's quiet web to protect infants is now a mass-market lifestyle accessory, dangling above beds of people who couldn't name the Great Lakes if you paid them. But let's not be too cynical. Global recognition has its benefits. The dreamcatcher has become one of the most widely recognized native symbols on Earth. You can walk into a market in Prague, see one, and immediately think, Native American. That visibility matters. It means indigenous culture didn't vanish. It's still here, woven into global imagination, impossible to erase. Even if it's sometimes cheapened, it's also stubbornly present. The problem is weight. For native peoples, the dreamcatcher isn't just a pretty shape, it's responsibility, inheritance, story. Every hoop carries centuries of maternal labor, spiritual protection, and resistance. So when outsiders buy one at a souvenir stand, hang it above their bed, and say, yeah, it keeps nightmares away. It can feel like watching someone read your diary out loud in a language they don't understand. They get the image, not the meaning. And yet, it's complicated. Some native artisans make dreamcatchers for sale, and rightly so. Selling their work supports families, funds, ceremonies, and keeps traditions alive in a world that rarely pays for survival. The line between appropriation and adaptation isn't always neat. Authentic dreamcatchers made by native hands can exist in both worlds, sacred and commercial, protective and symbolic. The danger is when the mass-produced versions drown out the voices of the people who first wove them. If you'd been born Ojibwe today, you might roll your eyes at the glitter-coated imitations sold online. But you'd also know that your grandmother still makes the real thing, still ties feathers with intention, still tells the Spider-Woman's story. You'd learn early that there's a difference between a dreamcatcher made for you and a dreamcatcher bought by someone who just thought it looked cool. And you'd carry that knowledge like armor be, 'cause one is heritage and the other is decor. So yes, dreamcatchers are global now. They hang in places as Saibikashi never imagined. They've been emptied, remade, and sometimes misunderstood. But they're also proof of survival. Proof that a fragile circle of willow and sinew could outlast colonial bans, tourist markets, and centuries of erasure. The world may mispronounce its meaning, but the dreamcatcher is still here, woven, gifted, lived. If you'd grown up under its shadow, you'd know that was the real hidden meaning. That behind the feathers and the hoop lies a truth sharp enough to cut through time. You can try to erase a people, but you'll never untangle their web. Across the world, humans have always looked at the same eight-legged creature and thought two completely different things: terror or reverence. The spider, tiny, delicate, sometimes venomous, always busy, has been both an object of disgust and a sacred archetype. It builds its home out of nothing but its body, spits out silk, finer than human technology managed until the 20th century, and arranges its web like a cosmic diagram. Somewhere along the way, nearly every culture decided that spiders weren't just animals, they were metaphors with too many legs. There is something suspicious about webs. They are fragile enough to collapse with a fingertip, yet strong enough, strand for strand, to rival steel. They appear overnight, perfect spirals or chaotic tangles, geometry built in darkness while everyone else is asleep. Ancient people didn't need scientists to tell them this was uncanny. The web was proof that reality itself could be woven, stretched, balanced, and crucially broken, which is why it turned up again and again in myths as the model for the universe, the soul, or destiny itself. The spider became an unavoidable teacher. Its patience, its ability to spin order from its own body, made it a symbol of creation. Its web, catching insects without effort, made it a symbol of fate. Its venom, often hidden until too late, made it a reminder that beauty and danger often come knotted together. Cultures looked at this miniature architect and saw themselves but distorted, uncanny an image of human creativity pushed to unsettling extremes. After all, humans weave cloth, but spiders weave worlds. The duality was impossible to miss. The spider sits still, meditative, almost priestly, waiting for vibrations in the web. Then, in a flash, it becomes predator, rushing toward prey with ruthless efficiency. Creation and destruction bound in a single body. For some, that made the spider a goddess, the weaver of life. For others, it made the spider a trickster, a liar, a creature whose silk trapped the arrogant and the unwary. The web could be a safety net or a death trap. Both interpretations were true, and that ambiguity gave spiders their sacred status. Even today, people flinch at cobwebs in the corner, as though they're trespassing in some fragile cathedral. The reaction is older than reason. Webs have always been liminal, half art, half trap, a symbol of persistence, but also of fragility. Their shimmer in the morning light makes them look like dew-covered jewelry, while their collapse under a broom makes them look like failure. And isn't that precisely how humans have always understood life, something delicate, glistening, easily broken, yet endlessly rebuilt? Anthropology, in its quieter moments, admits that the spider may be one of the oldest teachers. Long before people carved statues or painted gods on walls, they were watching arachnids spin architecture in mid-air. If you wanted a metaphor for the universe, interconnected, structured, perilous, and invisible until light revealed, E2 didn't need theology. You needed a spider. And so, it's hardly surprising that webs appear in myths from nearly every corner of the globe. Each culture assigning its own meaning but never dismissing the creature as irrelevant. The spider was never just an insect. It was the weaver of stories, destinies, and cosmic order. From North America to West Africa, from ancient Greece to Buddhist India, the spider sat quietly in the corner of human imagination, waiting, always weaving, always teaching, always reminding that the line between protection and entrapment is as thin as a strand of silk. In the traditions of the Ojibwe, the spider wasn't something to be crushed under a heel, but something to be revered, almost maternal. The figure of Koshi, the Spider-Woman, loomed over stories as protector and guide. Her task was not small. She was said to spin webs of protection over children, filtering out the darker forces that tried to slip in during the night. Nightmares weren't dismissed as random static. They were treated as intrusions, dangerous currents in the fragile river of sleep. And the Spider-Woman's web was the dam. When the Ojibwe lived close together, the story went, she could stretch her web across the lodges, guarding children where they slept. But as the people spread across wider lands, no single being, divine or otherwise, could be everywhere at once. The responsibility passed into human hands, specifically women's hands. Mothers and grandmothers began weaving small replicas of her web from willow hoops and sinew, a miniature version of her cosmic net. These became the first Dreamcatchers, fragile circles hung above cradles, each one a quiet declaration. The Spider-Woman still watches, even if only through us. The Hopi and Navajo carried their own versions. Spider-Woman appeared as a teacher, not only of protection, but of weaving itself. She was said to have taught the people how to spin fibers into cloth, how to create order from strands. Weaving was never just economic work, it was cosmological training. To weave a blanket or a rug was to echo the Spider-Woman's act of threading the world into shape. Every pattern carried meaning, every knot tied you back to her original web. These teachings carried with them a sense of responsibility. The web wasn't a passive decoration, it was an active filter, holding the balance between order and chaos. For the Navajo, Spider-Woman offered guidance on the loom, reminding the weaver to leave a deliberate spirit line in the patterner, small imperfection, a way for the spirit to move in and out of the textile. Perfection was divine hubris. Webs always needed openings, just as lives always needed paths of escape. Across these nations, the spider was never just a predator. She was a grandmother, a teacher, a divine artisan. And the web was more than architecture for insects, it was instruction for humans. How to live, how to balance, how to create patterns that endured beyond one's lifetime. There's a curious inversion here. In many Western myths, spiders are cursed or monstrous arachne punished for her skill, webs dismissed as filth. But in these North American traditions, the spider is closer to salvation. Without her, there would be no weaving, no cloth, no protection from dreams. She's not a villain lurking in the rafters. She's the quiet figure in the corner, ensuring that the delicate strands of life hold together. And while missionaries and colonial authorities later dismissed these objects as superstition, the webs endured. Mothers still hung them above their children, women still tied sinew into circles, and stories of Spider-Woman continued to whisper across generations. Fragile though they seemed, these webs carried weight. They were both literal and symbolic, both protection and reminder. Life is woven, and so is survival. From here, the thread stretches across the Atlantic, where the spider takes on a different face, entirely less grandmother, more trickster. In West Africa, the spider was less grandmother and more hustler. Anansi, the trickster, slipped through stories like silk itself, sometimes clever, sometimes foolish, always unforgettable. Where the Ojibwe Spider-Woman spun webs to protect children, Anansi spun them to trap fools, chiefs, and even gods. He wasn't adored for his virtue but for his cunning, the kind that turned weakness into strength. The Ashanti told how Anansi, small and fragile, could outwit animals many times his size, elephants, leopards, even death itself. The web in these tales wasn't a protective filter, but a trap, an elaborate device for catching opportunity. And it worked. With nothing more than wit and silk, Anansi managed to steal stories from Niame, the sky god, bringing them down to earth for humans to enjoy. Think about it. The entire tradition of Ashanti storytelling was attributed to a spider who conned a god. That's not just folklore, it's anthropology wrapped in a punchline. The symbolism of the web here was double. On the one hand, it represented clever design, the ability to make something out of nothing, to spin survival from thin air. On the other, it symbolized manipulation, entanglement, the reminder that anyone human, animal, divine could be caught if they weren't careful. Anansi's silk wasn't maternal, it was opportunistic. If Spider-Woman taught you how to weave a life of balance, Anansi taught you how to cheat at it. But the trickster's appeal was obvious. For people living under rigid hierarchies, whether political or spiritual, Anansi embodied resistance. He mocked authority, outwitted the powerful, and exposed the absurdity of rules. In societies where survival sometimes depended less on strength and more on cunning, the spider was the perfect mascot. His web wasn't a home, it was a scheme, a plot, a joke waiting to be sprung. When enslaved Africans were brought to the Caribbean and the Americas, Anansi came with them. His stories survived the Middle Passage, shifting and adapting, becoming Aunt Nancy in the American South, or compare Anansi in the Caribbean. For communities denied power, his cleverness remained a model of survival. The web became metaphorical again, not just the literal silk of a spider, but the tangled networks of resistance, whispers, and survival strategies spun beneath the eyes of overseers. In this diaspora, Anansi was no longer only a folkloric trickster. He was a symbol of endurance. Stories about him, sometimes comic, sometimes sly, gave enslaved people a coded language, a way to speak about freedom and resistance under the guise of children's tales. The spider, once a local Ashanti trickster, became a Pan-African symbol of survival against impossible odds. His web stretched across oceans, binding together histories of loss and resilience. And so, where one tradition imagined the spider as guardian, another imagined him as subversive clown. Both, however, agreed on one thing: the web was sacred. Whether saving or deceiving, it revealed the same truth: life is a network, fragile yet binding, and the spider always knows more than it lets on. From tricksters on the West African coast, the silk stretches further still, into Mesoamerican temples where spiders carried not laughter, but divinity. In the highlands of Mesoamerica, spiders weren't jokers or tricksters. They were divine artisans, patrons of weaving, and the keepers of cosmic order. Among the Maya and Aztec, the act of spinning and weaving was so charged with meaning that to watch a spider at work was to glimpse a fragment of the gods' own labor. Threads were not just threads, they were lines tying human life to celestial cycles. The Aztec goddess, Tlazolteotl, for instance, presided over both weaving and purification. She wasn't depicted as a spider herself, but her dominion over spinning and cloth bound her to the spider's craft. To weave was to imitate the gods, to take loose fibers and bring them into order. And if weaving was sacred, then the spider, the original weaver, was divine by association. It wasn't just an insect hanging in a corner, it was a model of creation, small legs performing the same work the cosmos performed on a grander scale. Archaeology gives us plenty of reminders. Painted ceramics show spiders with spinning implements, web motifs carved into textiles, and depictions of goddesses with spindle whorls as divine emblems. Excavations of weaving tools in temples suggest that the craft wasn't only domestic, but ritual, part of the ceremonial maintenance of the universe. Each thread spun, each fabric woven, echoed the invisible web believed to hold the world together. For the Maya, weaving was closely tied to fate. Women were seen as custodians of this sacred skill, entrusted with the literal and symbolic task of holding communities together. The loom became a microcosm, vertical and horizontal threads crossing like the four directions, the woven fabric as the visible expression of balance. And when spiders crept into these stories, it wasn't as pests but as instructors, silent beings who demonstrated how to weave patterns that mirrored cosmic design. There is something chilling about this view. Imagine believing that every textile, every blanket, every ceremonial garment was not just useful but cosmologically necessary. A mistake in weaving could mean more than a crooked line. It could mean a misalignment with the order of the universe. The spider's perfection became the standard, and humans, always imperfect, wove with both reverence and fear. Even beyond textiles, spider imagery was tied to underworld journeys. In some Mesoamerican myths, webs were said to bridge realms, allowing passage between worlds. Webs marked thresholds, delicate yet binding, the kind of structure you had to respect if you hoped to move safely from life to death or from chaos to balance. The spider wasn't merely watching over the fabric of cloth, it was watching over the fabric of existence. If North American Spider-Woman hung her webs over cradles, and West African Anansi spun them into jokes and tricks, then Mesoamerican spiders tightened theirs across the loom of the universe. No laughter here, no cradle charms. Instead, a sharp reminder: the world itself was a woven fabric, and if you pulled the wrong thread, it might unravel. And just when the spider seemed exalted beyond measure, across the sea the Greeks spun a darker version of the same idea, where weaving talent wasn't rewarded but cursed. Leave it to the Greeks to take a perfectly good symbol of creation and turn it into a morality tale about arrogance. The spider, in their hands, wasn't a grandmother or a divine artisan, was a punishment. The myth of Arachne tells it cleanly, a gifted mortal weaver, bold enough to believe her talent rivaled that of Athena herself, challenged the goddess. The result was humiliation, destruction, and transformation. Arachne was turned into a spider, doomed to weave forever. Her descendants condemned to spin webs without rest. On the surface, the story was clear. Don't compete with the gods. But look closer, and the myth betrays something deeper. Arachne wasn't punished for being bad at weaving. She was punished for being too good. Her tapestries weren't clumsy insults, they were masterworks, flawless depictions of divine scandals. The problem wasn't her skill, it was her audacity. The web here became a curse, a symbol of art so dangerous it had to be condemned. Unlike the Ojibwe or the Maya, who saw weaving as sacred continuity, the Greeks turned it into a cautionary trap. Human creativity pushed too far becomes monstrous. The transformation into a spider carried its own irony. In condemning Arachne, Athena didn't erase her skill, she eternalized it. Every web spun since then was a reminder of her defiance. Spiders became living memorials to a woman who wove too well for her own good. You can almost hear the gods muttering, "You wanted to weave. Fine, we'll make sure you never stop." And yet, people didn't look at spiderwebs with pure disgust. They recognized their eerie beauty, their uncanny symmetry. Philosophers and poets remarked on their fragility and persistence. The web was both admired and feared, admired for its geometry, feared for its association with hubris and punishment. Walk into a Greek household and see a web in the corner, and it wasn't just a housekeeping failure, it was a reminder of divine retribution, a whisper that humans should know their place. Arachne's myth also reveals how deeply the Greeks linked weaving with storytelling. To weave was to narrate. Every thread carried meaning, every pattern was an argument. Arachne's tapestry told the truth about the gods, their crimes, their affairs, their hypocrisies. The web became more than fabric, it became evidence, and that was intolerable. Better to silence her in spider form than let her weaving spread inconvenient truths. It's a striking contrast with cultures that treated spiders as benevolent. Here, the creature embodies shame, exile, endless labor. The spider is condemned to the margins, building delicate traps that collapse with the faintest touch. The myth turns silk into stigma, reducing a sacred act to a cautionary tale. But the Greeks, for all their severity, still couldn't deny the metaphorical power of webs. Even in their literature, webs appeared as symbols of deceit, entanglement, and fate. Think of Clytemnestra in Aeschylus' Agamemnon, trapping her husband in robes like a spider ensnaring prey. Webs weren't just domestic filth, they were deadly structures, reminders that life itself could be caught and ended in silk. From the Greek world, the spider stretches eastward, where in South Asia webs weren't punishment at all but vast, glittering metaphors for the entire cosmos. In South Asia, the spider escaped the corner of the house and went straight into philosophy. Here, the web wasn't just a net for flies or a trap for the arrogant, it was the cosmos itself. Hindu and Buddhist thinkers reached for spider silk when they needed a metaphor for reality. Because what better image for a universe both fragile and infinite than a shimmering net that seems solid until you touch it? The most famous of these is Indra's net. Imagine a web stretching across infinity, and at every crossing of silk, a jewel. Each jewel reflects all the others, endlessly, so that every point contains the whole. It's a cosmology disguised as jewelry, interconnection made visible. Nothing exists alone. Everything shines in relation to everything else. Pull one thread, and the vibration carries everywhere. Destroy one jewel, and the whole loses coherence. To explain the structure of existence, philosophers didn't turn to mountains or oceans, they turned to a spider's handiwork. This wasn't just poetic imagery, it was metaphysical instruction. The web showed the principle of pratityasamutpā, dependent origination. Nothing exists independently. Every being, every moment, is caught in threads spun by others. Just as a spider's web holds itself by tension across empty air, so reality holds itself by relations, not by solitary entities. The web, delicate and terrifying, was the perfect symbol for this kind of thinking, dazzling to behold, but impossible to survive alone. In Hindu thought, the spider sometimes appears more literally. Certain texts describe the universe as spun by a spider, silk issuing from its own body, only to be withdrawn again. Creation and destruction weren't opposites, they were a rhythm. The spider spins out the cosmos collapses back into it. If the Greeks cursed their weaver, Indian tradition exalted hers. The spider wasn't punishment. It was godhood in miniature, proof that the divine creates, not from external tools but from itself. Of course, the web also carried darker connotations. In Buddhist imagery, web symbolized Maya, illusion. Just as a fly mistakes the web for empty space until it's too late, humans mistake appearances for truth. We walk into silk, convinced we're free, only to find ourselves bound. The web was both lesson and warning. The world glitters, but its glitter deceives. To awaken was to recognize the threads and slip past them, rather than thrash like insects doomed to exhaustion. Yet the fascination with webs didn't come from pure abstraction. Spiders were constant companions in village life. Their webs stretched across rafters and doorways, their patience uncanny. Watch one long enough, and you could see why philosophers thought it was in on a secret. A creature so small, yet capable of building something vast, geometric, resilient. It embodied the paradox of existence, fragile strands capable of holding entire worlds. So while Western stories often cursed the spider, in South Asia it became a philosopher's friend. Its silk wasn't just biology, it was a cosmic chalkboard, scrawled with lessons about illusion, interdependence, and impermanence. And just as the silk could shimmer beautifully in the morning sun, it could also vanish with the brush of a hand. Reality itself, hanging by threads. From this infinite net, the story threads back to Europe, where in the Middle Ages, spiders shifted roles against sometimes protectors, sometimes omens, always ambiguous. Medieval Europe had a complicated relationship with spiders. On one hand, they were admired for their patience, quietly sitting in corners, spinning threads that seemed miraculous in their precision. On the other, they were suspected of being tiny agents of the devil, lurking in shadows, weaving filth and witchcraft. The spider was both saint and sinner, depending on who happened to be squinting at the rafters. Christian writers sometimes praised spiders as models of vigilance. They spun tirelessly, rebuilt after destruction, and waited with a monk's stillness for prey to stumble into their nets. To some, that looked like devotion, a metaphor for persistence in faith. One sermon compared a spider's web to the soul's fragile defenses against sin, delicate, easily torn, yet worth rebuilding again and again. But then came the darker readings. Webs as snares of the devil, temptations disguised as shining threads. The spider itself a satanic craftsman spinning traps for the unwary. The folklore reflected this ambivalence. In parts of Europe, it was believed that a spider spinning in the home brought luck, its web a kind of blessing. Destroying it could invite misfortune, as though you'd ripped up a contract with fate. In other places, though, a spider in the house was seen as a sign of looming death, a messenger from darker realms. People would tiptoe around webs like they were holy relics or smash them with a broom, depending on which superstition they happened to inherit. Medicine, predictably, also got involved. Physicians and folk healers recommended swallowing live spiders wrapped in butter to cure fevers, or wearing spiderwebs as poultices to heal wounds. The logic was dubious, but the symbolism was clear. Webs were sticky, binding, purifying. Their fragility somehow translated into resilience when pressed against human skin. Whether it worked or not, and mostly, it didn't. The act itself showed how deeply spiders had crawled into the European imagination, not only as omens, but as tools. Witchcraft accusations made matters worse. Women who spun cloth were sometimes linked to spider imagery. Their looms compared to webs, their labor to instrument. A household full of webs could be interpreted as laziness or as diabolical presence, depending on the judge's mood. Spiders themselves, caught in jars or found in suspicious quantities, were paraded as evidence in witch trials. The line between sacred patience and demonic weaving was thin and dangerous, yet the fascination never died out. Monks doodled webs in manuscripts, poets used them as metaphors for fragile human ambition, and architects borrowed their geometry for rose windows in cathedrals. The spider's skill couldn't be denied, even if its reputation wavered between holy and cursed. People might spit at them in fear, but they also imitated their designs in stained glass. It was the classic medieval contradiction: admire creation, condemn the creature. So, While the spider in Europe never reached the exalted heights of South Asia's cosmic metaphors or the maternal grace of North America's Spider-Woman, it still haunted the imagination. Its webs were reminders of vigilance, fragility, and the fine line between divine patience and diabolical trickery. And beyond Europe's castles and cottages, in the islands of the Pacific, spiders would weave yet another role, that of ancestors, storytellers, and even navigators across the sea. Across the islands of Oceania, the spider didn't lurk in corners or whisper temptation. It strutted into myth as an ancestor, a creator, sometimes even a navigator. In Polynesian and Melanesian traditions, spiders were not pests, but kin-patient architects whose webs mirrored the networks of sea routes and family ties that bound island life together. Take the Pacific trickster spirit, Nero from Kiribati, sometimes depicted as a spider who created the world. His stories wove islands and skies into order, showing how something small could become impossibly vast. The metaphor was obvious. In societies where a single canoe could hold the destiny of a clan, the spider's web became a fitting model for survival. Each strand connected, each vibration meaningful. Navigation across open ocean wasn't so different from walking a web. Read the signs correctly, and you lived. Misstep, and you vanished. In parts of Polynesia, spiders were said to have helped people travel between islands. Their threads stretched not across rafters but across waves, spun into stories of bridges binding distant shores. A spider might lower itself from the heavens on a line of silk, mapping out the same descent that humans made when dropping sails into the sea. It was cosmology in miniature, sky and ocean reflected in the trembling arc of a web. Storytelling, too, belonged to the spider. Just as Anansi carried tales across West Africa and into the Caribbean, spiders in Oceania were credited with spinning narratives as carefully as silk. Their webs weren't only traps but texts, their patterns seen as lessons, maps, warnings. Oral traditions carried these associations, making the spider a figure that explained not only how to survive in the world, but how to narrate it. And there's something telling about that link. Oceanic societies, strung across vast stretches of sea, depended on stories the way a spider depends on silk. Knowledge had to be carried in memory star charts, genealogies, moral codes, all bound in oral webs. To forget a story was to cut a thread, and to many cut threads meant cultural collapse. The spider's patient weaving offered a model. Everything connected, everything holding together, nothing surviving in isolation. Archaeological hints support the symbolism. In Melanesian art, spider motifs appear carved into wood and painted on ritual objects, their webs echoing clan lines and land rights. In some cases, spider figures were invoked in initiation ceremonies, teaching boys that life itself was a network they had to navigate carefully. Step wrong, and you weren't just breaking rules, you were tearing silk that connected ancestors, kin, and gods. Unlike Europe's suspicion or Greece's punishment, the oceanic view was pragmatic, almost affectionate. Spiders were small but essential, overlooked but central, exactly like the threads of kinship that held scattered islands together. To insult the spider was to insult connection itself, and that wasn't a risk societies bound to the sea could afford. So, in Oceania, the spider became storyteller, ancestor, navigator, weaver not of corners but of worlds. And from there, the silk of meaning stretches into a more universal theme. Webs themselves, stripped of the spider, as metaphors for destiny, survival, and the cosmic order. Strip the spider away for a moment, and the web itself remains a structure so improbable that humans could never resist turning it into metaphor. Across cultures, webs became diagrams of existence, fragile yet resilient, symmetrical yet unpredictable, shimmering with meaning in the right light, and vanishing into nothing when ignored. No wonder people reached for them when trying to explain fate, destiny, or the invisible order of the universe. On the most practical level, the web was survival distilled. It fed the spider, trapped prey, and ensured continuity. For people watching closely, this was a revelation. Something almost weightless could hold life and death. The strands of silk, thinner than a hair, could stop a fly mid-air. To early observers, that looked like magic, or at least a reminder that strength doesn't always come from brute force. Sometimes it comes from patience and design. From there, the leap to cosmology was natural. A web stretched between branches looked like a map of the world, intersections like stars, radial lines like directions, the whole fragile system held together by tension. In myth after myth, webs became metaphors for how reality was structured. In South Asia, Indra's net envisioned the cosmos as an infinite lattice, each point reflecting all the others. In the Americas, Dreamcatchers mimicked the same principle, filtering what passed through. Even in medieval Europe, where webs were suspect, they still represented entanglement of sin, of fate, of the devil's tricks. The paradox fascinated everyone. Webs looked permanent, but collapsed with a brush of the hand. They looked delicate, but could hold more weight than seemed possible. They were transient, rebuilt daily, yet seemed eternal in their pattern. That contradiction mirrored human life too well. Fragile bodies, fleeting years, but a sense that some kind of invisible order tied everything together. The web was existence in miniature, and humans, being humans, imitated it. Weaving cloth was one of the earliest technologies, and many cultures believed the skill came from spiders. To weave was to echo the web, to participate in the same act of creating order from strands. A loom, after all, is just a human attempt at spidercraft, warp and weft, imitating radial and spiral. Every garment worn was, in a sense, a portable web, a reminder of the original model. But the web also warned of danger. To be caught in one meant death for insects, entrapment for prey. It became a natural metaphor for manipulation, deception, and inevitability. Greek tragedians loved it. Clytemnestra described her plot to murder Agamemnon as a spider's snare. Inescapable once stepped into. Later writers echoed the same imagery, using webs to describe politics, conspiracy, even love. The lesson was universal. No matter how free you think you are, there are threads you can't see, and once you touch them, they bind. That combination, safety and danger, creation and destruction, gave the web its sacred power. It wasn't just ornament or nuisance. It was a model of reality itself, shimmering, invisible, waiting to collapse. Which is why it persisted, long after myths shifted and gods changed names. The spider may have been trickster, goddess, or demon, but the web remained constant, an eternal image of connection and fragility. And so, as centuries rolled forward, webs never stopped catching meaning. Even in the modern world, where spider silk is studied in laboratories and mass-produced in factories, the old associations linger. The sacred threads stretch on, binding past to present. Which brings the story to its last turn. How webs and spiders, stripped of myth but not of weight, continue to live in modern imagination and appropriation. Even after centuries of myths, sermons, and whispered superstitions, spiders and their webs never retired from human imagination. They simply changed jobs. In the modern world, they turned into laboratory subjects, pop culture icons, and spiritual souvenirs, all while carrying traces of their older roles. The sacred threads didn't snap, they were rewoven. Science was the first to pounce. Once naturalists started studying spider silk, they discovered it wasn't just eerie, it was extraordinary. Stronger than steel by weight, more elastic than nylon, capable of stopping prey mid. Laboratories in the 20th and 21st centuries tried to copy it, from bulletproof vests to surgical threads. Biotech companies even engineered goats to produce spider silk proteins in their milk-can experiment. That sounded more like folklore than science. The spider, once symbol of myth, had become symbol of biomimicry, the ultimate reminder that nature was already running technologies humans could barely imitate. Meanwhile, literature and art never let go of the web's metaphors. Spiders crawled across novels as symbols of entrapment, obsession, or sinister patience. Kafka gave us the burrow, where the unseen threat feels like a spider's breath. Charlotte spun kindness into silk for children's books, while comic books elevated the spider into a reluctant superhero, proof that even arachnophobia could be repackaged as power. The web, still, was connection and danger, whether it was catching flies or criminals. But the older spiritual echoes lingered most stubbornly in popular culture. The Dreamcatcher, originally an Ojibwe gift for children, became a global symbol, sold in craft stores and hung above beds worldwide. Its web was stripped of its original story, but retained its aura of protection, its promise to filter nightmares. Tourists bought them, teenagers collected them, spiritual seekers adapted them. The meaning shifted, but the structure endured. Once again, webs became symbols of protection, even if the hands that wove them no longer carried the original teachings. There's irony here. In the West, Spiders still inspire fear. Arachnophobia is one of the most common phobias, but their webs inspire fascination, almost reverence. People might scream at the spider itself, but marvel at the silk geometry, photograph dew-covered strands, or admire architectural patterns based on webs. The creature remains suspect. The web remains sacred. That split is as old as Arachne and as current as the morning garden. And in quieter corners, some of the older associations survive intact. Indigenous communities continue to weave webs with intention, linking them to story and lineage. Folklore still tells of spiders bringing wisdom or warning, and in Buddhist temples, the metaphor of Indra's net still hangs, a jeweled web stretching through infinity. The myths never vanished. They simply folded into modern consciousness, half remembered, half repurposed. The result is that spiders and webs, for all their humble biology, remain among the most durable sacred symbols humans have ever invented. They thread together fear and admiration, utility and poetry, science and myth. Walk into any culture, past or present, and there it is, a fragile structure hanging in the corner, shimmering, waiting, daring you to make sense of it. The sacred never really left the web. It just learned to survive, strand by strand, long after people stopped looking up. For most of human history, falling asleep wasn't the safe slide into unconsciousness people imagine today. It was more like stepping out of the door without locking it, except the house in question was your body. Dreams weren't idle hallucinations, nor harmless flickers of the brain. They were breaches in the wall between worlds. And breaches, as every farmer, hunter, and priest knew, could be exploited. What modern people call just a dream was, for countless cultures, an event as consequential as breaking a bone or angering a spirit. If a nightmare visited, it wasn't a bad movie projected in the skull. It was a force arriving uninvited. Sleep didn't free you from reality, it doubled it. Now you had two fronts to defend, the waking body and the wandering soul. The danger was obvious to anyone watching a sleeper twist and cry out in the night. Something was happening, and there's something no less real for being invisible. Across the Arctic, elders warned that the soul slipped out during dreams, traveling through landscapes as real as tundra and snowdrifts. If it lingered too long, or lost its way, the body might not wake. The vulnerability was terrifying. You might go to bed healthy and never open your eyes again, not because of disease or accident, but because your spirit failed to return from wherever it wandered. The same fear appeared in Melanesia, where people described dreams as journeys into other realms. The dreamer's essence was thought to walk, swim, or fly into zones filled with ancestors, spirits, and enemies. The geography was as perilous as any jungle path. You could meet someone who wasn't supposed to be there, or be struck by a hostile charm, and the damage would follow you back into waking life. An unguarded dream was as reckless as leaving camp alone at night. In such a world, precautions weren't luxuries. People slept beneath charms, whispered protective words, or placed ritual objects at the edges of mats and beds. The Ojibwe created Dreamcatchers, not as trinkets, but as defenses, miniature webs meant to filter what passed through the night air. In Europe, a knife under the bed or iron nails in the wall were considered enough to keep malignant spirits at bay. A dream was never just a dream. It was a doorway, and doorways demanded locks. The weight of dreams also came from their authority. They weren't private fantasies, they were public obligations. If someone dreamt of a bad omen, a failed hunt, or the death of kin, the dream had to be addressed, spoken, sometimes ritualized. To ignore it was dangerous, almost negligent. Dreams carried the same accountability as waking actions. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets recorded thousands of interpretations, each dream catalogued like legal evidence. An unheeded dream could topple a king as surely as a rebellion. So when people lay down in the dark, they didn't expect comfort. They expected risk. The bed was not refuge but threshold, a liminal zone where dangers multiplied. If the waking world demanded vigilance against predators, hunger, or rivals, the dreaming world demanded equal vigilance against forces even harder to name. A nightmare might be a demon, a curse, or the hand of a jealous neighbor. And if the soul wandered too far, no amount of morning sunlight could coax it back. Sleep, then, was not rest, it was exposure. And the dream, soft, silent, invisible, was as sharp-edged as any waking threat. which is why, across cultures, people came to see it not as illusion but as travel, an excursion. The soul had no guarantee of surviving, and if the soul could leave, then the question was immediate: what if it never returned? Or worse, what if something else slipped in to take its place? The belief that dreams were dangerous began with a simple observation. People looked asleep, but something about them wasn't entirely there. Breaths slowed, limbs twitched, eyes flickered beneath closed lids, as if watching a theater invisible to everyone else. It was easy to imagine that the soul had slipped out for a walk, leaving the body behind like an empty house with the windows open. And everyone knew what happened to empty houses. Things got in, things got out, and sometimes they never looked the same afterward. Among Siberian peoples, this wandering soul was treated as fact. Shamans described dreams as literal journeys across tundra, forests, and skies. A person asleep could find themselves hunting, fighting, or conversing with beings no one else could see. These weren't metaphors, they were expeditions. The danger lay in geography. Travel too far, and you might not return. Meet the wrong spirit, and you might wake with sickness or madness clinging to you like frost. Death in a dream wasn't a figure of speech, which was the body's last night. In Melanesia, a dreamer's soul was thought to roam so freely that it risked being intercepted. Enemies could capture it, trap it, even eat it, which explains sudden illness or weakness upon waking. Dreams weren't a private stage play. They were opportunities for attack, arenas where the vulnerable essence of a sleeper could be cornered. To sleep without ritual protection was to risk walking into an ambush unarmed. North American traditions carried similar warnings. Among the Iroquois, dreams were treated as desires or obligations of the soul. If a dream asked for something and you failed to fulfill it, the soul's unrest could turn into misfortune. A simple vision of eating berries might demand an actual offering, or else the dreamer's health would deteriorate. The soul wasn't politely imaginative, was bossy, insistent, and dangerously literal. Ignore it, and you risked paying the price. These fears weren't confined to small-scale societies. Even in ancient Greece, philosophers like Heraclitus spoke of the soul wandering during dreams, feeding in realms apart from the body. The Roman writer Artemidorus catalogued dream journeys as maps of what the soul encountered elsewhere. In Egypt, the Book of the Dead echoed the same anxiety, that in sleep, as in death, the spirit drifted into regions where judgment and danger waited. Dreams blurred into afterlife rehearsal, and who could rest easy under those conditions? Protective measures became as routine as blankets. Charms were tied to cradles, herbs burned by the bedside, prayers muttered before lying down. In Siberia, shamans tied ropes or threads to sleeping children, symbolically tethering their souls so they couldn't wander too far. Elsewhere, iron nails, knives, or amulets weighed down the space, pinning the sleeper to the body like a paperweight on loose parchment. The message was simple. If the soul insisted on traveling, it needed a safety cord, because if the soul could leave, something else could enter. That possibility haunted every society that treated dreams as travel. The open doorway worked both ways. The sleeper's essence might drift out, but spirits hungry, mischievous, or hostile could also drift in. Waking with strange thoughts, impulses, or illnesses was often explained as possession during sleep. The bed was a contested zone, a border post where patrols never stopped, and once the soul's journey was accepted as real, the content of those travels mattered. Encounters with ancestors, spirits, or gods weren't dismissed as hallucinations. They were obligations, instructions, sometimes threats, which leads to the next peril, when a dream wasn't just dangerous because of where the soul wandered, but because of what it demanded once you woke. Once the soul's nightly wanderings were accepted as fact, the next step was inevitable. Whatever it saw, heard, or demanded had to be taken seriously. Dreams weren't personal entertainment, they were public obligations. A vision wasn't yours to keep. It was a message, and failing to act on it was like ignoring a command from the highest court. Mesopotamia took this very seriously. Clay tablets from as early as 2000 BCE catalogue entire dream manuals. If you dreamt of eating dates, good fortune was coming. If you dreamt of losing teeth, death was near. If you dreamt of flying, the gods were about to send a message. These weren't vague fortune cookie lines, they were treated as binding prophecy. Kings built temples or launched wars based on what someone saw while unconscious. Ignoring such a dream wasn't an option. It risked insulting the gods who bothered to send it. Egypt wasn't much more relaxed. Priests at dream temples encouraged people to sleep within sacred precincts, hoping divine beings would appear with instructions. A dream there could dictate everything from agricultural rituals to royal marriages. The dreamer woke, not with a curiosity, but with an assignment. Imagine waking from a nightmare today and being told, "Congratulations, you've just volunteered for state policy." The Greeks carried the same weight, dressing it up in philosophy. For Aristotle, some dreams were random noise, but others were messages from the divine, warnings of illness or catastrophe. Hippocrates went further, linking dreams to bodily health. Dream of flooding rivers, and it might mean your humors were out of balance. It sounds almost comic until you realize people made life-or decisions based on whether they'd dreamt of frogs, snakes, or broken shoes. In indigenous North America, obligation took another form. Among the Iroquois, a dream wasn't just symbolic, it was a literal desire of the soul. If you dreamt of a feast, your family had to provide one. If you dreamt of a gift, someone had to give it. A dream ignored became a dream festering, and a festering dream meant sickness or misfortune. The dreamer wasn't indulged, they were obeyed. Entire communities rearranged themselves around a single person's nocturnal visions, because to deny the dream was to endanger everyone. The Aztecs also treated dreams as reality-shaping events. Warriors paid close attention to dream omens before campaigns, while priests recorded them as indicators of cosmic balance. A bad dream could cancel a battle, a good one could spur sacrifice. In a society already structured by ritual precision, dreams were not footnotes, they were part of the machinery. What's striking in all these traditions is how little patience there was, for the modern shrug of it was just a dream. That attitude would have been reckless, even suicidal. A dream of death might mean ritual purification was needed. A dream of ancestors might demand offerings. Dreams were debts, and debts unpaid were dangerous. The danger wasn't only external, what gods or spirits might do if ignored, but internal. To disregard a dream was to let imbalance fester in the soul, a kind of spiritual negligence. If the soul had gone out to gather messages, refusing to deliver them was an insult both to the spirit world and to one's own inner life. And of course, not all dreams were prophetic gifts. Some were clearly hostile, filled with terror and suffocation. If dreams could deliver obligations, they could also deliver attacks, which is why nightmares were treated not as bad luck, but as real assaults in the dark. If ordinary dreams were obligations, nightmares were ambushes. They weren't brushed off as brain static or the result of indigestion. They were treated as real assaults. Evidence that something hostile had slipped through the cracks while the body lay helpless. Nightmares were not all in your head. They were in your chest, on your back, in your lungs, pressing, choking, gnawing. In medieval Europe, this experience had a name, the night hag. People described waking in the dark, pinned to their beds, unable to move, a crushing weight sitting on the chest. It wasn't sleep paralysis, it was an attack. The hag was believed to ride sleepers like animals, draining life, planting terrors, sometimes even stealing breath itself. In German folklore she was the Alp, in Scandinavian tales the mare. The origin of the word nightmare, and these weren't metaphors. They were real encounters, leaving the victim exhausted, shaken, convinced of visitation. The incubus and succubus were more invasive still spirits who slipped into dreams to assault sleepers sexually, feeding off vitality, planting sickness. For centuries, medical texts and demonologies described these events as genuine risks of sleeping unprotected. A restless night might not mean you tossed and turned. It might mean you'd been molested by something invisible. Outside Europe, the same fears appeared under different names. In parts of Southeast Asia, the Fayam spirit was said to crush sleepers, leading to sudden death in the night. Among the Hmong people, this experience became tragically famous in the 20th century as nightmare death syndrome, where young men died in their sleep after reporting terrifying nocturnal attacks. The medical diagnosis pointed to cardiac events, but culturally it was interpreted as spirits killing in dreams. The line between myth and mortality blurred. In Africa and the Caribbean, sorcery was often blamed for nightmares. A rival or witch could send their spirit to torment you in sleep, tying knots in your chest, tangling your soul in invisible cords. Waking with heaviness, sweats, or a racing heart was evidence you'd been attacked. The response wasn't a trip to a doctor but counter magic, protective charms, cleansing baths, communal prayers to drive the invader away. Even in indigenous North America, nightmares weren't dismissed as quirks of the mind. They were active dangers. The reason protective objects like Dreamcatchers were hung above sleeping children. The web wasn't decoration. It was a shield, catching intrusive forces before they could slip into the sleeper's breath. Without it, children were exposed, vulnerable to terrors too small to see and too heavy to fight. The striking thing is how consistent these accounts are. Across continents, people described the same sensations: weight on the chest, paralysis, the sense of another presence. Modern science groups them under sleep paralysis, but ancient cultures saw coordinated attack. Dreams weren't the safe sandbox of the mind, they were contested terrain. And because they were battles, protection was necessary. Knives under beds in Europe, iron charms in the Middle East, salt circles in Asia, webs in America. Each culture placed weapons around the sleeper, like a garrison guarding a fortress. The bed became a battlefield, and sleep became warfare waged in silence. But not all dream dangers came from outside. Sometimes the threat was generated within, when sleep dredged up forbidden desires, shameful acts, or taboos that could stain waking life. If nightmares were assaults from the outside, dream contamination came from within, an inner sabotage that was just as feared. Dreams could reveal acts never committed in waking life, yet dangerous enough to stain a person's reputation, soul, or even their community. To dream of breaking a taboo was not entertainment. It was guilt written in silk, and the stain could spread unless treated. Take ancient Greece. If a citizen dreamt of committing incest or murder, it wasn't brushed off as weird brain stuff. Priests and dream interpreters classified such visions as pollution. They demanded purification rituals, sacrifices, or confessions. A dream of patricide could put you in ritual quarantine, even if your father was still happily sipping wine at breakfast. The logic was cruelly simple. If you dreamt it, your soul had already rehearsed the crime. In Polynesia, dreams were equally binding. Taboos tapua, strict rules that structured social and sacred life. To dream of violating one could bring disaster, not because of intent, but because of contact. If someone dreamt of eating forbidden food or touching a sacred object, purification was required. Dreams didn't care about your excuses. They implicated you whether or not your hands had ever lifted the object in waking life. Jewish tradition carried similar anxieties. The Talmud preserves discussions about bad dreams filled with sinful acts or omens. These weren't dismissed. They were taken so seriously that rituals existed for counteracting them. A fast, called Tonat Chalam, could be performed after a disturbing dream to nullify its effects. The logic was straightforward. A dream could contaminate, and fasting burned away its residue before it could bloom into catastrophe. Medieval Christianity, always suspicious of nocturnal wandering, added another layer. Lustful dreams, especially for monks and nuns, were framed as direct temptations from the devil. A single erotic vision at night could require days of penance, not because the body had sinned, but because the soul had failed to guard itself. The line between involuntary experience and moral failure blurred into nothing. You could wake guilty of things you'd never chosen to do. This fear of contamination extended into collective responsibility. Among the Iroquois, dreams that revealed antisocial desires had to be enacted symbolically, sometimes publicly, to purge their danger. If ignored, the dream could spread harm to the dreamer's kin, or even the entire village. The dream wasn't private, it was a community hazard, like a leaking roof or a poisoned well. What's striking is how little distinction was made between thought, action, and dream. In societies where spiritual balance was fragile, a dream wasn't harmless fantasy, it was a breach of law. The imagination was real, binding, and perilous. A crime committed in sleep could be punished in ritual, and failure to address it could doom more than just the dreamer. The paradox was merciless. Sleep was supposed to refresh, but one wrong dream could wake you condemned. The body might be innocent, yet the soul had already wandered into crime. It was as though sleep exposed the most unguarded version of yourself, and the spirits were standing by, taking notes. And if ordinary people dreaded such dreams, shamans were thrown directly into them because their initiations often demanded the most terrifying experiences. Staged not in waking life, but in the dreamscape itself. For shamans, dreams weren't passive episodes to endure or interpret. They were ordeal trial grounds where the soul was torn apart, stitched back together, and claimed by powers that didn't ask politely. To become a shaman meant surviving terrifying initiations, and these often played out entirely in dreams. Night after night, the bed doubled as a sacrificial altar. Across Siberia, accounts describe initiates dreaming of being dismembered by spirits, bones boiled, flesh stripped, organs removed, and replaced with crystals or magical stones. The dreamer's skeleton might be reforged with iron rods, their blood replaced with glowing liquid. This wasn't metaphor, it was the logic of transformation. To gain power, the old body had to die. The fact that it happened in dreams made it no less binding. Waking up didn't cancel the ritual, it confirmed survival. Among Amazonian shamans, the process could be equally grotesque. Initiates reported dreams where jaguars devoured them, tearing limb from limb, before spitting them out, whole but altered, part human, part beast. The jungle itself seemed to participate, strangling and consuming, then returning the dreamer with sight beyond sight. These initiatory nightmares weren't considered hallucinations, they were literal contracts with spirits, marking the boundary between ordinary humans and those destined to heal or curse. In Central Asia, dream initiations sometimes meant ascending to the sky on ropes or ladders, pursued by hostile beings. Falling meant death. Reaching the summit meant acceptance. The danger wasn't symbolic. The dreamer could wake sick, bleeding, or half paralyzed, as if the spiritual wounds had followed them back. People around them recognized the signs not as illness but as evidence. The spirits had chosen and marked their candidate. What unified all these accounts was terror. A shamanic dream wasn't a pleasant vision of animals nodding approval. It was horror designed to strip away the self. The dreamer was reduced to bones, devoured by beasts, boiled alive, hurled into pits, cut into fragments. Anthropologists, dutifully writing it all down, often remarked on how similar these accounts were across regions separated by oceans. What they rarely noted is how disturbingly vivid the details were, as if nightmares were drawing from the same script everywhere. And yet, these dreams were embraced as necessary. Without them, no one could claim the authority to heal, prophesy, or speak with spirits. A shaman who hadn't been torn apart in dreams was incomplete, unproven, potentially fraudulent. The nightmare was proof of authenticity, like an invisible diploma etched on the soul. Survival meant you weren't merely human anymore. You were an instrument of forces that could just as easily kill as cure. The irony, of course, is that while most people prayed to avoid terrifying dreams, shamans required them. What terrified the average sleeper was the very door they needed to pass through. In the dark theater of the dream, spirits sculpted them with cruelty, and the scars, though invisible, shaped an entire life of power. And once the soul had been dismantled and remade, it was destined to encounter others in the same twilight zone, because the dead, too, walked in dreams, and they were never shy about visiting the living. If the living were bold enough to wander in dreams, the dead were bolder still. For countless societies, dreams were the main avenue by which ancestors and restless spirits visited the living. Forget seances or Ouija boards, most people expected their deceased relatives to show up while they slept, sometimes offering blessings, sometimes demanding attention, and sometimes just haunting like uninvited house guests. In many African traditions, the dead were regular dream visitors. Among the Zulu, ancestors were believed to speak directly through dreams, warning of illness, prescribing rituals, or demanding offerings. A dream of a grandmother wasn't sentimentality, it was a summons. Failing to respond could bring misfortune on the entire household. The dead, it turned out, were micromanagers. Indigenous North American traditions carried the same weight. Plains peoples reported dreams where the departed appeared with guidance for hunts, wars, or healing. These weren't symbolic appearances, but literal communications. The boundary between dream and waking was thin, and ancestors walked across it freely. A dream of a dead warrior might mean a blessing in battle or a warning that one's own death was near. Either way, it wasn't ignored. In Polynesia, dreams of the dead could be deeply unsettling. Spirits of the deceased were thought to call sleepers to follow them into the afterlife. To dream of walking with a dead relative, especially toward water, was a dangerous omen. The sleeper's soul might be lured away permanently. Nightmares of the dead weren't dismissed as grief, they were understood as invitations to die. Waking from such a dream required immediate purification, lest the pull of the departed continue into waking hours. Ancient cultures elsewhere held similar fears. In Mesopotamia, Dreams of the dead were catalogued as ominous signs, often requiring ritual appeasement. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself describes encounters with the dead through dreams, treating them as authoritative revelations. Egyptians, too, left records of dead relatives offering instructions from the dream realm, proving that even a well-mummified ancestor wasn't done meddling in family affairs. The danger lay in repetition. One dream of the dead could be interpreted, balanced, resolved, but if the same spirit appeared again and again, it suggested unfinished business or, worse, that the dreamer's own soul was slipping too close to the threshold. Anthropologists noted cases where repeated dreams of the dead were taken as evidence of impending death. The soul, already in conversation with the departed, might soon join them. The logic behind these beliefs was relentless. If the soul wandered in dreams, then of course it would encounter others wandering too, and who had more reason to linger in the borderlands than the dead. They weren't bound by flesh, only by memory and ritual. Dreams became a crossroads where the living risked contamination by the unfinished business of the dead. Communities responded with rituals. Food offerings, prayers, and protective charms were meant to settle the dead, keeping them from calling too often. But there was no guarantee. Dreams were porous by design, and the dead knew the way in. And if the dead could deliver messages in dreams, so too could the future, because dreams weren't only conversations with ancestors. They were also forecasts of battles, victories, and disasters, sometimes so convincing that entire wars were won or lost before the first spear was thrown. For warriors, dreams were not idle fantasies, they were battle reports, delivered ahead of schedule. Entire campaigns hinged on what someone saw in sleep, and no general could afford to shrug off a vision when the alternative was leading men into disaster. The battlefield didn't begin with the clash of weapons. It began with whatever unfolded the night before. The Zulu placed enormous weight on dreams before raids. If a warrior dreamt of blood, defeat, or ominous animals, the campaign could be cancelled on the spot. It didn't matter how well armed the regiment was, or how badly the chief wanted victory. A bad dream was intelligence, straight from the spirit world, and ignoring it was as reckless as charging into battle without shields. Dreams weren't what-ifs, they were tactical data. The Romans, naturally fond of omens, also used dreams as military intelligence. Generals consulted dream interpreters before campaigns, and victories or disasters were often justified retroactively through dream reports. A soldier's dream of Jupiter blessing the army could become a rallying cry. A commander's nightmare of fire might be cause to retreat. No one wanted to be remembered as the fool who lost legions because he ignored a dream. Among indigenous North Americans, dream visions played a direct role in warfare. Plains warriors reported spirit animals appearing in dreams, offering protection or guidance. A warrior who dreamt of a powerful figure, say, a bear or a thunderbird, might paint its symbol on his shield, trusting it to turn arrows and bullets. These weren't symbolic gestures, but practical protections. The shield was wood and hide, yes, but its power came from what had been promised in sleep. Aztec warriors also leaned on dreams. A good dream could mean victory was assured. A bad one might delay a campaign. The stakes were high. Warfare fed the Aztec state with captives for sacrifices. Dreams were part of the logistical machinery. An ominous vision wasn't personal bad luck. It was national crisis management. Dreams could even cancel bloodshed entirely. In some Pacific Island cultures, if opposing chiefs both dreamt of disaster, battles were avoided. The dream's authority outweighed human bravado. Better to retreat alive than to defy a warning only fools would ignore. But the cruel irony was that dreams could also manipulate. Leaders learned quickly that reporting certain dreams could sway troops. Claiming to have dreamt of victory was as good as issuing propaganda. Soldiers rallied, convinced the spirits had already weighed in, and if the campaign went badly, the dream could be reinterpreted after the fact. Clearly the gods had meant victory in a spiritual sense, while the slaughter was just a minor physical inconvenience. What made dreams so effective in warfare was their ambiguity. They could be stretched, twisted, reinterpreted to fit nearly any outcome. A vision of fire might mean destruction of the enemy, or destruction of your own men. Either way, the dream was validated, because once reality caught up, interpreters adjusted the meaning accordingly. Dreams never lost. Only commanders did. For warriors, then, the night was as perilous as the battlefield. Dreams decided whether weapons were raised, painted, or left sheathed. And because dreams dictated so much, societies surrounded sleep with defenses, charms, rituals, architectural tricks meant to fortify the body while its soul wandered. Beds weren't just for comfort, they were fortified positions. If dreams were treated as real as battles, then sleep required fortifications. The bed wasn't a place of rest, it was a fortress under constant siege. People across centuries developed elaborate systems of defense, turning bedrooms, cradles, and even hammocks into ritual strongholds. Falling asleep without protection was like leaving your city gates wide open with a sign reading, "Spirits welcome, free snacks inside." The Ojibwe Dreamcatcher is one of the most elegant examples. A hoop of willow, webbed with sinew, hung above the sleeping child, not as decoration but as a filter. Malevolent forces caught in the web would burn away with morning light, while benevolent dreams slipped through feathers like water down a reed. In its original form, the Dreamcatcher wasn't mass-produced trinketry. It was part of a nightly defense system, crafted with precision because the stakes were high. Europe had its own defenses, less delicate but equally paranoid. Knives slipped under pillows, scissors hung above cradles, iron nails hammered into doors. The logic was clear. Iron-sharp edges and cold steel repelled spirits. Beds became little arsenals, ringed with weapons that were never meant to be wielded, only displayed to scare invisible intruders. The sleeper was less a dreamer than a guarded hostage. In the Middle East, amulets etched with verses of the Quran or protective symbols were tucked near sleeping spaces. Some traditions placed bowls of water by the bed, a liquid trap for wandering spirits. In China, mirrors were positioned to repel ghosts, bouncing their images back and confusing them until dawn. In each case, the bed became a perimeter defense, monitored not by guards but by objects humming with symbolic power. Even architecture played a role. In some indigenous Pacific traditions, doorways and thresholds were marked or ritually blessed to prevent harmful spirits from entering sleeping quarters. The idea was simple: protect the liminal spaces, and you protect the sleepers. Houses themselves were weapons, designed to channel, deflect, or repel whatever prowled through the night. Children, of course, received the strongest defenses. Across cultures, infants were considered especially vulnerable, their souls still loose and unanchored. In Europe, charms were sewn into swaddling. In Central Asia, red threads tied around cradles. In Africa, protective beads strung across tiny wrists and ankles. The child was outfitted like a small but significant fortress, guarded from dream invasion as much as from illness. And if objects failed, prayers filled the gaps. Evening invocations were whispered, not for comfort, but for survival. A medieval Christian might mutter, "Now I lay me down to sleep," not as sweet sentiment, but as a shield against demons. In Islamic tradition, reciting specific surahs before bed served the same purpose. Words, sharpened into ritual, became barriers around the sleeper's fragile, wandering soul. The common thread, pun unintended, was the assumption that sleep was never neutral. It was exposure, a nightly vulnerability requiring a whole toolkit of defenses. Curtains, charms, knives, feathers, all these were as crucial as food or fire. Because without them, the soul wasn't just exposed to dreams, it risked never returning at all. And that possibility led to the most unnerving conclusion of all, that dreams and waking reality weren't separate at all, but equally dangerous realms feeding into one another, both capable of killing, binding, or haunting. The supposed safety of the modern bedroom hasn't erased the old fears, it's just given them new vocabulary. Freud and Jung made entire careers out of reframing nightmares and taboos as the whispers of the subconscious. Instead of spirits pressing on your chest, it became repressed desire. Instead of ancestral warnings, it was archetypal symbolism. The terror never went away, it was simply dressed in Viennese psychology. Cigars included. Take sleep paralysis. Today it's explained as a misfiring of REM cycles, a body waking before the brain has finished its checklist. But anyone who's felt the crushing weight, the immobility, the shadow in the corner knows why every culture invented spirits to explain it. Clinical terms don't erase the sensation of a stranger leaning on your ribs at 3 in the morning. A demon, a hag, a ghost, it hardly matters. The body believes. Nightmares remain sticky too. No one shrugs off a dream of falling teeth, betrayal, or the dead knocking on the door. People still wake with hearts racing, still whisper prayers. still search dream dictionaries online, as if Mesopotamian scribes had simply migrated to the internet. The same anxiety lingers, that what happens in sleep bleeds into waking life, carrying consequences that can't be dismissed with coffee. Superstition adapts. In Southeast Asia, sudden nocturnal deaths are still linked to spirits sitting on sleepers' chests. Among the Hmong diaspora in the United States, reports of nightmare deaths persisted into the late 20th century, straddling the uneasy border between cultural belief and unexplained medical event. The line between dream and death is still thin enough to unsettle coroners. Even popular culture refuses to let dreams be harmless. Horror films build entire franchises on the premise that the dream world can kill. Nightmares are treated as literal battlefields. Freddy Krueger, a pop culture distillation of fears that Siberian shamans and medieval peasants would have recognized instantly. The stage has shifted from firelight to cinema screen, but the terror remains familiar. And yes, the Dreamcatcher has become a global icon, hanging in bedrooms far from its origins. But even as it's reduced to neon plastic in tourist shops, the underlying idea that dreams are porous, that they need filtering, still resonates. People hang them not just for decoration, but for reassurance, a faint echo of the same protective logic that placed knives under pillows centuries ago. The persistence is telling. Rationalism has put dreams under microscopes, measured them in brainwaves, and yet people still talk about them as omens, still feel haunted by them, still treat them as revelations or attacks. The language changes, spirits become neurons. Demons become disorders, but the unease doesn't. Sleep remains exposure. What anthropology shows is not that ancient people were naive, but that they were paying attention to the same unease that wakes modern sleepers at 3 a.m., heart pounding, unable to explain why the dark feels crowded. Dreams remain dangerous, not because they can literally kill, but because they collapse the line between what's imagined and what's real. They infect waking life with fears, obligations, and suspicions that logic can't shake. And so the ancient suspicion survives, that closing your eyes is never entirely safe, that every night is a crossing, and that sometimes, no matter how many alarms you set or pillows you stack, you don't know exactly who or what will meet you on the other side.